Before we dive into to the four main segments of the watching brief this month, there are a couple of stories we want to highlight. One of them is actually on the horizon, and we're starting to see this ship, as it were, come into port in the form of post-COVID, post-furlough scheme trouble for particularly the smaller museums and institutions out there, as government help starts to dissipate. The link of the month this month is actually to a story about the Bronte Museum in Haworth, the parsonage where the Bronte sisters grew up and wrote so many of their stories. Has put out a call, essentially a crowdfunding plea, to highlight the fact that post furlough, post government help, they're looking at an economic black hole in their finances. Um, Now, one could, and one often does, in my case, go on a rant about the nature of the economy and how it is that these museums shouldn't necessarily just be for profit. They are there to enrich our lives and so on and so forth. Viability issues could also be raised, but the point is, this is going to be much more common probably in the coming months. So we're putting a little flag on it here. That said, though, at the beginning, before really the meat and bones of furlough, meat and veg of furlough was announced, we were seeing museums like Creswell Crags putting out cries for funding and aid as well, weren't they? Because they could see that they weren't going to survive up until help came. Never mind after help has gone away. Um, is it possible, though, that this isn't all doom and gloom? Is it possible that maybe we'll see the Chancellor responding to individual sector needs and requirements? Because ours isn't the only sector which is currently saying to Rishi Sunak, we need more help, or we're not going to make it through the winter.
No, I mean we'll be, and this isn't just affecting small organisations like the Bronte Parsonage either.
No.
It's we're going to be doing a segment later on in the show about one of our largest cultural institutions, which is blaming COVID for a radical restructuring and major staff losses
Yeah. Yes.
that are coming down the line. Now, in terms of particular sector support, the government has been adamant so far that the furlough scheme, whereby the government effectively nationalised the payroll of many companies in order to try and keep them viable until the economy could reopen, is coming to an end in November. By November, it's starting to wind down now, and it comes to an end completely by November. However, there is pressure on Chancellor Sunak to continue support for some sectors. Cultural sectors the cultural sector is beginning to reopen. We're seeing museums reopening. British Museum reopened last week. Other museums, larger museums, are reopening. The ones that can reopen with adequate social distancing, because the social distancing rules are still in place. But obviously, smaller museums have difficulty reopening at all. If they can, it's so much reduced footfall that it's whether it's even worth them reopening.
Yeah. Whether they could literally keep the lights on with such reduced
That's right,
footfall.
and
Yeah.
and exactly, and places like the Bronte Parsonage obviously fall into that category. Basically, it's a house, a small house in a village in Yorkshire.
And it's a period property, so in that sense, the corridors aren't designed for social distancing.
Precisely.
Yeah.
No, exactly. I mean, I'm on the board of a trustees of a Grade 2 listed building, which was built in the 1920s, and that's one of our biggest problems. That the corridors and doorways and room access. It's not a big open plan modern building. It's it's all discrete packages, and it's not so much when you're inside the rooms. It's actually getting people to and from the rooms safely within the rules. So this is not something. It's not something that's easy to deal with.
Also good to say. Also, having been in that building, another element would be, and this would apply to other such places, would be things like access to the cafe, access to the gift shop. These bring in
the
money
basic
to
things
these
like the
sites.
loos.
Yeah.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
the basic things like the loos. The guidance is you even more so than normal. You have to do regular cleaning, which means having basically a cleaner on duty.
Yeah.
That's an extra staff person. That's an extra person at probably minimum wage, unfortunately. But but that hadn't been budgeted for.
No.
So it's there's some very difficult decisions people are having to take, but the thing, the other, and the government would say that we've put 1.7 billion pounds towards maintaining the cultural and arts sector,
Mm.
but there is a lot of criticism at the moment that that has been quite slow to mobilise.
Hmm.
That the application process is perhaps more cumbersome than it needs to be. And I'm not endorsing it. I'm making an observation here. It's not applicable to everybody, but also that it's primarily aimed at buildings and not people.
Mm.
Um, and particularly the freelance payments, although there were people falling through the gaps in that as well, particularly people who were paid through having formed a private company and becoming paid themselves as directors or employees of that company. Um, it was a fallible system, but it was better than nothing. People are pointing to the contrast of contrasting this country with Germany, where the German furlough scheme has just been extended for a year by Angela Merkel.
Yeah.
Um, heritage sites at least can reopen. The sector that is suffering probably most in culture is the performing arts, music and theatre, where even the biggest, most well-off commercial producers who run shows at ongoing profits, like Les Mis and Cameron Mackintosh, is laying off staff and are not looking at coming back to the West End until at least next spring.
Yeah. No, exactly. So that's on the horizon. Although we're absolutely seeing the wake of that ship as it comes into port, without a doubt.
It's the mast above the horizon and coming towards
Mm.
us, and I think the last thing we can do is, and the government would like us. The government is trying to get everyone back into the office this week, saying as though everything was fine. It's not. COVID is not over by any means,
Mm.
and will not be for probably the foreseeable future. Unfortunately,
No.
at least it's well into next year.
No, indeed. And in the second part of this preamble, this actually quite long
Preamble ramble.
preamble,
Preamble ramble.
preamble ramble, we want to just highlight uh, uh, the 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 acquisition of Ancestry.com by an investment company called Blackstone. Um, they have bought the company, the website, and the company archives, therefore, as well, for a total of $4.7 billion, which is an awful lot of money to invest in an ancestry service. Uh, but crucially, this is actually something that we flagged a while ago in the watching brief as a potential issue in terms of personal privacy and rights in terms of access to data.
Watching brief. Finger on the heritage pulse.
Yeah, precisely. We saw this coming a mile off. Dare I polish my fingernails? In so much as the issue here is that if you hand over your DNA to a company like this, you're more or less handing over the rights to that information as well. And in this
Well, more or
instance,
less, you are. It's in the terms and conditions.
well, yes, sorry, yes, precisely. You are precisely doing that, and this is one of the issues that we flagged when companies like, for example, Oxford Ancestors were going under. Brian Sykes himself, actually, a grand old um, pioneer in the ancient DNA sector, was highlighting what he saw as one of the problems of I suppose, moving away from an academically question-driven model to a consumer service and client-driven model for this sort of
Well, they've coined the phrase, haven't they? Consumer genomics.
precisely, yeah, consumer genomics is essentially it's precisely what Brian uh, feared would happen. And in this instance, Blackstone aren't investing in a history company. They're not investing in the ability for you to make connections with ancestors. Companies like this don't do nice things. They're investing in the profitability of that data, and in particular, I mean, you've made um, uh, passing remarks in the past about the ability to maybe, I don't know, advertise to you a topical health cream, if you're genetically predisposed to eczema or something. This sort of stuff, that's the thin end of that wedge, and also that's probably the most benign part of that of that particular wedge. Um, this could this could become quite a big monster, and it also could market to you with particularly imminent sense of urgency. Obviously, that's a tautology there, but it could really basically say, look, other people with very similar genes to you have died of this disease, therefore you need this medicine. There's something that can come that comes with
It's
it.
more direct. It's more direct even than that, though, Mark, because
Mm,
as health professionals, researchers discover more and more about the genetic components of various conditions,
mm,
diseases and conditions. What this enables you, if a company like Blackstone, through a company, an operation like Ancestry.com, has access to this massive database of people's DNA,
mm,
there is the possibility, for example, if you've got a genetic disposition to, say, for example, certain cancers,
mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
to market you directly a private cancer screening test
Yeah,
that saying you have got a genetic disposition to this. Wouldn't it be a sensible precaution too?
yeah. Mm.
And the way private medicine makes a lot of money is in unnecessary testing. It is alleged.
Well, I've certainly heard radio adverts where they sort of say, do our, and they'll call it like the health scan or something like that, where we can
Yeah,
test you for 5 different types of cancer, this kind of thing. Why
yeah,
not? Why
yeah,
not just take that worry off your shoulders and get
yeah,
checked? Yeah, but if they can
yeah.
be more specific, if they can actually say, well, actually, you're highly likely. So in my case, for example, unfortunately, my father died of bowel cancer. In my case, they'll probably, flag that, and kind of say, you should get tested, you should get checked, um,
Yeah.
which is quite predatory in that sense. And it all
Oh yeah.
stems from this thing that we saw coming all the way down the track. This question of who owns your DNA and who owns that particular sequence once it's produced.
Absolutely.
Not to
And I
sorry,
think that
what, sorry, not also sorry, not to
come.
mention the after the fact companies as well. There are lots of companies out there who will invite you to import the results that you've gained, for example, from Ancestry into their database. And from
Absolutely.
there, they'll offer even more esoteric things. So a couple of months ago, we talked about on Watching Brief this question of making weird historical and religious analyses of your DNA. This month, I actually saw an advert for a company that was saying things about spirituality.
Yes.
like almost not literally, but almost essentially saying, "Will you go to Buddhist heaven?" We can tell you because of your DNA. But and that's the after. That's the after initial test. That's the people who just then monkeying with the data.
Yeah.
This is only going to get bigger, I think.
Absolutely. Data. Big. I mean, people have talked about big data for some time. I remember
Mm,
writing. God, my first comment about big data in archaeology, I think, was around 2010,
mm,
when I first started looking at things like this, sort of journalistically rather than just archaeologically.
mm.
Um, and thank you for referring to me as a journalist, by the way. I'm not a real journalist. It just happens that what I do these days is more journalistic than it is archaeological. But anyway,
You're an
we'll let that
investigative
one. We'll let that one
journalist. You've got your hard nose to the coal face of archaeological happenings. You have questions asked of the DCMS all the time.
I
You're
will
you're
buy.
you're you're on the ball. You're
I will go
happening.
out and buy. I will go out and buy a trench coat. I'll wear it for the next watching brief. Uh, no,
Need a
that's it.
hat with
Anyway,
the card, the press card.
oh yeah, the press conference.
Yeah,
Yeah, absolutely. The trilby. Yeah. No. Yeah, big data is a commodity,
yeah.
right? And if nothing, I don't want to use the B word, but that was how Brexit happened in large part
Spare jar.
by the pit.
Pling. Thank you. Yeah.
Uh, but by the people on the Leave campaign were driven by often startup or relatively new digital companies with big funding from across the Atlantic,
Mm,
who saw money and opportunity in very large databases.
mm,
The argument was whether they use those databases always legally, and it appears possibly not,
no.
probably not, in fact.
Mm,
But it was just a sign of where things are going, and this is exactly something. But I think the privacy issues are very, very real. You can imagine, for example, if you've got sensitive genetic information such as a predisposition to a particular disease, particularly, for example, if somebody came up with a genetic link to, say, certain mental health conditions, and I know there's research going on in that area,
mm.
how sensitive that will be, particularly from an employment point of view.
Yeah, that's a very good point. Yeah.
Or and always, in extreme cases, from the point of view of the ability to blackmail somebody, for
Blackmail,
example, a
pit someone,
politician, or yeah,
dating profiles,
dating profiles, you name it.
yeah,
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 um,
potential children, whether or not
yeah,
someone might, yeah.
absolutely, absolutely. And if WikiLeaks has shown us nothing else, it's that there is no such thing as a secure database anywhere in the world, even a company one, let alone a company one, even a
Governmental one,
government one,
yeah.
a
So, so,
governmental one.
so is this where the R word comes into it? Are we talking about the need here for regulation or not?
I think the EU has gone a certain distance on GDPR, but I mean, when it comes specifically to DNA in the medical world, I think that there is a real precedent for the ethical issues that are
Mm.
around this. Um, and I don't know if the name Henrietta Lacks means anything to you. Um,
Yeah, well, I think there's been a film recently about her that's come out. But
but
go ahead.
yeah, Henrietta Lacks was a young black woman living in Virginia in the 1950s,
Mm,
and she died of cervical cancer,
mm,
leaving a young daughter and husband. But when she was in hospital being treated, um, some of her cells were extracted by Johns Hopkins Hospital in Baltimore, in Maryland. And for some reason, the cells didn't die. And there is now what is called an immortal line of what they call HeLa, He capital LA cells, which are used in research and so on. And essentially, those are Henrietta.
yeah,
It's Henrietta's DNA.
yeah.
Um, and this came to light relatively recently. There's a book by an American journalist called Rebecca Skloot called The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks.
That's it. Yep.
And it
I think
looks,
I think there's
yeah,
a film based on that. Yeah.
I'm sure that, yeah,
Mm,
I think, yeah, I'm pretty sure you're right there.
mm,
I'm sure you are right there. And what Rebecca Skloot did was look at both the impact of this on the medical profession, having this line of cells available for research, but also on Henrietta's family when they found out what had happened, and the disconnect that they felt, and the sense of how it enhanced their sense of having lost them. She interviewed her. You know, they didn't even know this had happened for a quarter of a century.
mm, mm.
Um, and
So here we have a weird balance, don't we, between informed consent and the
yes,
great potential of such interventions and such data
but
and such
but
such
the great
harvesting.
research potential, yeah, the
Mm,
great research potential, but also the great financial potential.
yeah.
If that line of, if you donate your DNA to Ancestry,
Hmm.
and then your DNA suddenly becomes the basis of, say, a cure for the sake of argument, bowel cancer,
Hmm.
that will make the drug company that could come up with that treatment billions in profits from sales around the world,
Mm,
more than covering its research costs.
hmm.
And you would see none of that. Although, in a sense, something even more intimate than your intellectual property has actually been the basis of that investment. Now, is
Yeah.
that acceptable or is it not? That's the question I think we have to ask, the debate we have to have.
Yeah. And
Do you should we have copyright in our own DNA?
yeah, well, and it's interesting, isn't it? Because there's also a certain disconnect in terms of visible capital there, isn't there? Your stuff is the capital, in which is driving that particular profitable activity, and yet because it's not, it's not like a brick of gold that's been taken out of your pocket. One is less likely to go, "Oi, that's me, that's my, that's my stuff." Yeah, it's an interesting question, but this preamble has now gone on for around 20 minutes, so we should move on.
We shall amble away in the direction of the rest of the show.
Yes. Yeah.